Now, the paper in the form that you have it and that Gennaro has it is not much more than a compilation, a selection of chapters from a new book that has come out this week called Indian Political Theory. Now, obviously, Henrik wanted and wants unpublished work, so what I had in mind to do was to take what I have just done and test it and struggle with it in the light of all of your papers and the conversation that we have here. So keeping in mind this conversation and where it has been, where it goes today, and where it continues to go, I will rewrite what's now being presented. I just want to give some background because we're changing disciplines a bit. I work mostly in political science departments, law departments, and philosophy departments, never in sociology. So I often think like a lawyer or a jurist. I usually think like a political theorist, and I always think like a philosopher. So whatever you hear me say that strikes you as a sociologist as being in some way perverse or obscure, you can just try to rethink it in terms of those characteristics. So the background for this, we'll go back to the turn of the previous century, so around 1900. And G.K. Chesterton published in the London News on Gandhi's birthday in 1909 an article that deeply affected Gandhi. And I'm going to read some of that to you just because it's very funny and it's very important for what the background of what I'm trying to say. So Chesterton first writes that he's embarrassed when his friends come to him to talk about the new direction that the Indian National Congress is taking and the Indian national movement, what form it has around the 1900s to 1909 when he writes. And basically it's emerging demand, or it's transformative demand from representation in government in the empire to independence. So Chesterton writes, "I do not doubt for a moment that the young idealists who ask for Indian independence are very fine fellows. Most young idealists are fine fellows. I do not doubt for an instant that many of our imperial officers are stupid and oppressive. Most imperial officials are stupid and oppressive. But when I'm confronted with the actual papers and statements of the Indian nationalists, I feel much more dubious and, to tell the truth, a little bored. The principal weakness of Indian nationalism seems to be that it is not very Indian and it is not very national. It's all about Herbert Spencer and heaven knows what. What's the good of the Indian national spirit if it cannot protect its people from Herbert Spencer? I'm not fond of the philosophy of Buddhism, but it is not so shallow as Spencer's philosophy. It has real ideas of its own. One of the papers, I understand, that is the papers of the Congress Party, is called The Indian Sociologist. What are the young men of India doing that they allow such an animal as a sociologist to pollute their ancient villages and poison their kindly homes?" Now, Gandhi was, quote, thunderstruck by this article, and he immediately translated it into Gujarati. And then, as you probably know, a couple of months later, Hind Swaraj is the document that he produces. So Hind Swaraj is the first formulation to recalibrate the national movement and to, in some way, address Chesterton's farcical comments that the Indian national movement is neither Indian nor national. He makes it now very Indian, and he recalibrates the sense of nationalism to background classical conceptions like territoriality, ethnicity, and so on, and to foreground something new, and that emerges in the concept of Swaraj. Swaraj has been around already. It's a neologism, but it's been around for some time when Tilak introduces it into the nationalist discourse. But Gandhi reinterprets it, rewrites it through Hind Swaraj and subsequent writings and activities to simultaneously sustain not just the notion, the political one self-determination, but also the moral one of some kind of authenticity. So authenticity takes on then this double concept of political and personal and moral. Now, 100 years later, Perry Anderson's series of assaults in the London Review of Books presents an eerie repetition of Chesterton's thoughts 100 years earlier in a London paper. This became known as the Indian Ideology, a 2012 book. And it didn't get a reply from Gandhi, of course, but it did get a reply from Partha Chatterjee, Nivedita Menon, and Sudipta Kaviraj. If you put the three of them together, you almost get Gandhi. What you find in their reply, that was a joke against Henrik, whose supervisor was Kaviraj. Okay. What you find in their reply is, and I don't think it's just limited to the reply that Chatterjee, Nivedita, and Sudipta make to Anderson, but something that repeats itself over and over again in the intellectual, let's say, traditions that they represent, is a lack of options. Now, in decolonial theory, we speak about options, ways of being otherwise than the hegemonic modern. Whether or not, now this is the first very controversial thing I'm going to say, whether or not there's any truth to this is something that I have my doubts and reservations about. At least these options that are articulated, for example, by Boa de Sousa Santos or Mignolo, may strike someone, and they do strike me, as various kinds of romances. Now, I will discuss what I mean by romance later. It's part of the topic of the book. But let's set that very contentious point aside for a moment. What's less controversial is that post-colonial theorists, so I'm distinguishing decolonial and post-colonial, which we haven't done these 2 days, have indeed suffered from a lack of options. Now, let me quickly say what I mean by post-colonial theorists in contradistinction to decolonial theorists. And also in the context of what I had talked about, the national movement. So after independence, what you find for about 20 or 30 years, now this is a thin slice of contemporary intellectual history, only so far as it can be used for cultivating a notion of where political theory in India stands today. So I'm skipping out on a number of different disciplines and the evolution of ideas in different ways. But in political theory, as we conceive it now, up until around the late 70s, there was a very modernist orientation. So the processes of decolonization, by which I mean not just the dissolution of empire, but I mean literally white people getting up and leaving professorships from the couple of universities that were established in India. These chairs had to be filled, and they had to be filled by Indians. And what kind of people filled them? You had two camps of people generally that filled them. One were the modernists who continued to carry on the very program that was introduced by those universities in the first place. The earliest writings of Rajni Kothari, I know we all deeply respect him and so on, but his very earliest writings represent that tradition very, very plainly. In this modernist vein, you remember there's a process of what is sometimes called recontextualization. That is, picking up a concept that was generated in the transatlantic world and importing it, and then filling it in with a new context. So I think we've just heard a paper that more or less describes how this works. In India, we saw throughout the 60s, for example, if that concept was generated in the United States, like federalism, you'll get a book in the 1960s that tells you that India is improperly federalist. So in the 80s, if Europe is the place where the concept of secularism is believed to normatively arise, when we import it here, the modernists then tell us that India is improperly secular. So what happens is that the context, these various places, take all the blame for the inadequacy of the concept. And this was a modernist movement that we've seen and that was generated in a great deal of literature in the 60s and 70s. In contrast to that, a rival movement, which was very powerful and continues in various forms today, was an anti-modernist, what we can call what we loosely but perversely refer to as a fundamentalist style of thinking. So this production of literature like The Wonder That Was India, which this wonder happens not to include anything from the Islamic background of India somehow. Or V.R. Mehta, political philosopher's identification of the Indianness of Indian political history in Brahminical Hinduism. So this reaction to the modernism, in a kind of anti-modernism. Something happens in 1978, very concretely, the publication of Said's Orientalism, which changed the options available to this modernist and anti-modernist camp. So from 78 to about 1985, the intellectual milieu changes quite dynamically. In 1980, then Ranjit Guha starts writing. In 83, Peasant Insurgency is published. And then Partha Chatterjee's Nationalist Thought in 86, but written in 84, 85. Something happens between the publication of Said and basically 1985 that suggests the emergence, a transition of a new kind of thinking. And principally because Orientalism, as you all know the book, told us about the fundamental defects of these options, of the modernist one, which identified modernization and westernization, and the reactionary one, which suggested that this is nothing more than carrying on the cloak of the Orient in an Orientalist mode. So a new option opened up, and that was made very concrete in 1985, a very special year because you had the simultaneous publication of Gayatri Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, which was published in 2 cities at once, New York and New Delhi. The publication of Homi Bhabha's Science Taken for Wonders, published only in the United States, and then the publication of Ashish Nandi's An Anti-Secularist Manifesto, published only in Delhi. The reason that I talk about the place of publication should become clear in a minute. Now, this inaugurated a new way of thinking in political philosophy, political theory, and I think social theory in India, which moved from recontextualization to reconceptualization. Let's start to problematize these concepts that have been brought in. Let's start to rethink the concepts, blame the concepts instead of blaming the context. And this went on with several prominent schools all the way up to today. Ananta had mentioned Dipesh Chakrabarty's Provincializing Europe. Everybody is familiar with the work of these people. It usually takes place in 2 kinds of rival camps. One is one that maintains fidelity to Anglo-American styles of thinking, so Akhil Bilgrami's writings, or Neeraj Chandok, or Bhikkhu Parekh, or Ratna Kapoor, Amartya Sen, Rajiv Bhargava. One that is more oriented towards either post-structuralist or later, in this moment, becomes defined as postmodernism, like Gayatri Spivak, Upendra Bakshi, Dipesh Chakrabarty, and so on. That has ruled the intellectual domain and come to be known throughout the world as post-colonial theory. Where is it published? Where is every book by every single person that I mentioned published? If you look at your own bibliographies in your papers, just ask you, where is every book published that you mention that is a resource for theory? I don't mean a resource for data, but a resource for theory. Now, post-colonial theory, I suggest, as we know of it, is internal to the transatlantic self-understanding. It is not some, let's say, authentic discourse that's happening elsewhere in the world, which miraculously came to our attention because of whatever reason. They would never come to our attention, and the proof of it is in your own papers, that the place of publication for the books that you refer to as the sources of theory are never outside of the transatlantic world. They may be for data. You all know this, right? Brahminical theorists and the empirical Shudras. So we, in the so-called post-colonies, provide the data, but we don't provide the frames of theory. The irony is that the post-colonial theorists have been gaining a great deal of mileage on this, presenting this formula, but publishing in the transatlantic world. Now, what do I mean by transatlantic world? I don't use words like Western or Global South or so on, except to try to be clear. The transatlantic world is that part of the world that universalizes its particularity and enforces that universalization through hard power, military power, soft power, economic power, and cultural and ideological power. And we've been dealing primarily with the ideological power, that is, the academic influence. But I think the academic influence means nothing without the nexus with the soft economic, as you know by citing the endowment of Harvard and so on, or the military. Now that's a little more contentious, but there is evidence to support it. What we see right now in India emerging in political theory is a third movement, another transition away from the reconceptualization. And why? Because of the realization that this post-colonial discourse has been to the advantage of certain communities, very mobile, urban Indians who can go abroad, who can publish in top journals and so on, and has been to the disadvantage and hiding certain realities that the rest of the people who stay in India and try to work on the ground here face. So there's been a second transition away to what I refer to as deconceptualization. Deconceptualization is known in jurisprudence and in India studies through people like Bala Gangadhara, little frightening personality, leans to the RSS, very anti. Yeah, Sujata's shaking her head. He terrifies me as well. G. Mohan Gopal, who engages in very, you know Mohan Gopal. No? He engages, G. Mohan Gopal. He was the Vice Chancellor of the National Law University in Bangalore. He is also has been an advisor to Congress Party on the for the Justice Department. And one of the practices which I myself witnessed was the way that he calls the sweepers, the cleaners of certain circuit and regional courts to come and sit next to the judge to explain what he thinks justice is and to advise the judge on how the decision should be made. Now, this deconceptualization is a turning away from both the projects of recontextualization or modernist understanding, but also of reconceptualization, or in other words, the attempt to engage, as post-colonial theorists have been doing, constantly with the transatlantic world. Why? Because the problems that the transatlantic world has in creating a more equitable or inclusive academic curriculum is not going to help us. It's not going to help us in Malaysia. It's not going to help us in India. It's in some respects irrelevant if the very conditions that we are speaking about, which is that we don't want to keep importing norms, is going to be something that we actually follow. So how does this deconceptualization occur, and what is going to fill the vacuum? Where are these concepts going to arise from? And this is the important point, because everywhere in the world that we have observed a vacuum, for example, look at the Iranian Green Revolution from a few years back. What are the options that face the students of these revolutions? These options have and continue to be articulated in these classical formulas like, was it Benjamin Barber or somebody else, Jihad versus McWorld. You know this book, Jihad versus McWorld? Has anyone? So this is a classical formula. We get it in India, and you can see that in Partha Chatterjee, Nivedita, and Sudipta's response to Perry Anderson, that what we do not want is westernization. We don't want Perry Anderson's first world Marxism, which has no comprehension of what's been happening in most of the world, as Partha Chatterjee puts it. But our only alternative seems to be saffronization. So what do we get by sloughing off all of this loud noise and baggage of the hegemony of concepts and discourses from the transatlantic world? Once we slough it off, we're left in a vacuum, which is immediately filled by fundamentalist and rightist and saffron discourses. And obviously the way the Arab Spring played out the way the Green Revolution played out, and the way that many of these popular movements play out is precisely that. We're stuck with something that is possibly more terrifying than what we just attempted to liberate ourselves from. So is there a way forward in contemporary political theory beyond this, or in the process of this deconceptualization, that is not going to lead us to a kind of saffronization or fundamentalism? My argument is that it is to be retrieved in this concept of Swaraj that has transited from Hind Swaraj to contemporary discourses through a number of people that, obviously we can't deal with here, but that it's fundamentally premised on one principle. And the principle is important because a principle has to be found. And I'm going to say one last thing. I'm sorry I'm taking Gennado's time. I'm going to say one last thing about this principle. Recently I've read a paper entitled Islamic State as a Social Movement. Now, when we speak about social movements or the demand of democratization or egalitarian or anti-patriarchal conditions for how either an academic discourse or a social movement should necessarily proceed, where do we get this? Where do we get these conditions? I mean, who has said that, or on what basis would you say Islamic State is not a social movement? That's an appropriation of the concept of social movement. And where do you stand when you say that? Obviously, you stand outside of the Islamic State, right? Otherwise, you wouldn't be articulating it like that. Where do you stand? I think we stand in the modern. And if that's the case, we have a great deal of work to do in decolonizing social theory, because we might have this immediate proliferation of papers such as Islamic State as a social movement if we don't lay down the conditions and the sources of the conditions for egalitarianism or anti-patriarchy or whatever that we all assume to be true but fall outside of sociology. The virtue of political theory is that they don't fall outside of the domain of political theory. Every act of sovereignty or claim of sovereignty has to have a justification. And my notion about Swaraj is that it's a thin conception, one that people can politically assent to. You don't have to have fundamental epistemological or ontological or theological commitments to come to terms of agreement that Swaraj should be egalitarian, anti-patriarchal, and so on. It'll go too far to get into all of those reasons, but if you had torture of reading John Rawls when you were a student, you can see it as analogous to this notion of overlapping consensus. The fundamental difference is, of course, that Rawls, like all normative theory, was ungendered, deracialized, non-religious, and so on. In this case, we are speaking of a consensus precisely of gender or race or class or caste or privilege. And this notion of justification for the conditions of egalitarian or the requirement of an egalitarian approach to social movement, or the direction that guides us forward in choosing an option between the jihad and make world, is what I call thin Swaraj, and grounded in the political thought of Dr. Ambedkar. So that's in a way what I try to do in the paper and in the book.
Many thanks. The paper, even if it's in a provisional state, it's very interesting and in some passage very eloquently written, so it has been a pleasure to read it. So I got two sets of questions. First one that comes from reading the paper, the second one coming from listening your presentation. So I would like to ask you a couple of questions and then the others. So the first one that comes from reading your paper is the the will to have a clearer understanding of your approach to the concepts that you are trying to get into the discourse about Indian political theory, particularly the way you approach them in terms of different possibility and understanding of the relation with the texts that you are using. If you think of your approach as a genealogical one, or rather than a philological one, an hermeneutical one or an exegetic one, which I think that it is important for the general discussion we are having these days. So my question is, do you think that there are some truth inside the text that have some trans-historical meaning rather than being time by time contextualized according to what usage you can do it in the present? And this also is connected to a more general question with that I would like you to clarify. If you think that there is a distinction and what it should be between a decolonial approach and a non-Western approach to the concepts that you are bringing to the fore, in the sense that it is something that is within modernity, or is it something that goes back to forms of knowledge that are non-modern, and so the non-Western comes to overlap with tradition, as in the paper we have been that has been presented this morning?
First these two, and then
Yeah.
let me deal with the second one, because the first one I've never actually. I know what I do, which is an amalgamation of a number of different approaches. It comes from my multidisciplinary background, and maybe there's not a harmony or a superseding logic that can organize the way that I do it. So I'll have to think about that. I think what's behind the title of my paper is that when this vacuum arises, what do we do now that we've recognized, let's say, the failure of certain concepts and the domination of our entire educational system by the forced repetition and usage of those concepts? The vacuum immediately compels a leap backwards to tradition. And as I mentioned in the paper, this is something that we've seen in history a great many times in a great many different fields. So Heidegger, speaking as a philosopher, Heidegger's early work being in time, when he decided to attempt to get back to the meaning of being as he thought the Christian tradition and subsequent philosophy had prevented us from accessing it. It was a leap back over history. Now, Heidegger has performed that in philosophy, and contemporary nationalists, proponents of Hindutva and some RSS ideologues want to do this for us today. So, the fear that I have about a book like the Gita, for example, is that if you look back within Indian history, there was a complete silence about this work for several centuries. It just didn't appear for I think, 5 full centuries. But from the 19th century, and in fact from its publication in English, from the time of its publication in English, suddenly it became our tradition. It became our Bible. Now this is a process of the Semitization of Hindu religion, according to the lines that somebody like Savarkar, an ideologue from the RSS, let's say a rightist ideologue, wants us to believe, because the only way to fight the West is by producing a muscular Hinduism. This was the era when Gandhi tried to eat meat because he knew that meat made Europeans strong and tall. So this attitude of finding the sources of your tradition by leaping back over the era of colonization is it's not peculiarly Indian, but it's appeared very often everywhere, but it has always rightist tendencies. So my suggestion is that there's no need to leap back over, because what we're going to find there is, of course, the tradition of the indigenous elites. And the problem of the evoking or returning to tradition is that you almost inevitably come to the tradition of the indigenous elites. Okay, it's indigenous, which is very nice, but it's, you know, India's 1%, that, to put it in that, you know, we are the 99% sense. So leaping back to tradition has authoritarian, rightist, ideological tendencies. So where is it that we're going to find it? Instead of leaping backwards, I suggest that this is happening on a different axis. It's going downwards. So it's a process of discovering, like I described with G. Mohan Gopal and the way that he brings the sweeper into the courtroom to advise the jurist about the nature of justice as far as he understands it. The place to go is not back into find our tradition, because it's not our tradition. You know, each of these rival traditions belong to different communities that identify with them or that they were imposed upon. Instead, go down to the people, because that is in any way the source of sovereignty. It is these people who are supposed to be the ones who have signed the social contract that justifies the nature and presence of the state in the first place. So why not go back down and do a kind of listening to the concepts and practices that are occurring in the present. You don't need to be anti-modern or non-modern. And in the specific location, we don't have to be Western or non-Western. This is a universal, in some respects, necessity, because while it's true that if you, let's say, wake you up when you're in Italy, wake you up in the middle of the night and ask you
even
what is the nature of justice, right?
Sorry, even this morning.
Yeah, this one. You will know, you will in some way respond to that. It resonates with your, not just your education, but your life experiences.
Yes.
If you ask my maid the same question, wake her up in the night and ask her about certain constitutional principles of our country, they're all completely alien. I've done this. So going back and resurrecting a tradition is to find something as alien as the sources of contempt or the concepts of contemporary sovereignty. The only place we can go is down to the lived experiences of the people.
Yeah, I'm quite sympathetic with this tension. I also do believe that this kind of third way between modern and anti-modern is the path. I think this is a shared understanding of the way non-Western concepts can be actually being brought to the fore. What I'm less sympathetic with is a sort of simplistic understanding of the way to go down towards the so-called 99%. For two reasons. The first is political, the second is epistemological. The first one is that I think we live in a period where the claim to the people and to the so-called 99% is as far as rightist as the anti-modern. And I've been thinking also, for instance, to leftist populist movements in Europe and the way they create a sort of empty space that is going to be filled by rightist movements, while the epistemological reason is more connected to a sort of hidden heritage of Scottish Enlightenment, which presumes that the closest concept to reality is the concept of practice, while actually few think in terms of what the very concept of practice does, is that it is the first and thus the strongest way of abstracting from a chaotic reality. So the presumed hierarchy between the practice, which is closer to the reality, and what you hypostatize upon it actually should be subverted in a sense. So,
Yeah.
but this is my position. I would like to understand
Yes,
yours.
that's not just your position. That's, of course, the Hegelian position is a very early essay where he says, look at when we watch a public hanging and the horror that we express, and he attempts to invert the notion that the practice is somehow concrete while ideas are abstract. I sympathize with that, and I understand. I understand that concern. I'm not talking about 99%. Actually, I'm talking about 23%. Now, which 23%? I have a very concrete case for who represents the universal. It's a very Marxist plagiarism. You know, when he writes that there is a class that is no class because it doesn't suffer any particular harm, but harm as such. And that's where he invests the notion of universality. I've more or less plagiarized that, but fill it in with a concrete population, which are the Indian former untouchables. Mm-hmm. The former untouchables have an ironic demand for a strong state. And this is part of the problem I have with post-colonial theory and other theories emanating from the first so-called first world Marxists about the actually that logic is very clear. I don't need to explain that to you, but the relationship of people and the state and the oppressive nature of the state and so on. So this particular community doesn't necessarily identify with the concepts or ideas that are prevalent in our discourses. So I don't exactly know where would be the source of the universal that they mediate through their practice, to use yours or Hegel's notion. What universal are they sneaking in? I don't think anybody knows. We don't have concepts to understand these experiences. We have supervening concepts like human rights. So now you'll get work like Dalit human rights and so on. But as you know, this kind of conception supplants any kind of vernacular self-conception of both my oppression and my emancipation. So what we get is not just a modern Western ideology that is supposed to produce through its capitalist system oppression, but we also get simultaneously the solution also from that, which is a discourse of human rights. So if you will just frame your oppression, fill in the blank, how are you being oppressed, we'll get back to you in 24 hours with our solution. So I think the vocabulary that's used in the totally excluded, the ones that have been left out of post-colonial theory as well. I mean, now is the moment of the appropriation of Ambedkar, but as Sumit Sarkar pointed out, the subaltern studies went for a good 25 years without even mentioning Dalits. And who is the subaltern par excellence, if not the Dalits? So these people have been excluded not only from history as it is unfolded in reality, but also theoretical conceptions of history and also theories about the emancipation from that history. I mean, they're excluded from the bottom to the top. And so suggesting that they carry in some way the concepts of ideological state practices and so on doesn't seem to make sense. It doesn't reflect, I mean, where would they have acquired these concepts? It's all a jagged procedure.
And do you think that this option might exclude or works without any form of representation? So do you imagine a direct connection between the self-perception and how they express their own condition and issues and claims?
I mean, everyone has got the vocabulary that we've been taught to use to articulate both our aspirations and our feelings of betrayal and injustice and so on. And so the Dalits have these as well. The point is not to interview and record what's going on that simply, but to understand the ways in which the practices are articulated from within their own vocabularies. So it's not an interview thing, it's an experiential thing, and it's not something that takes 1 minute, because the construction of these concepts didn't take a minute. It's something that takes a decade, at the very least. But what do we do for that decade? And this is the controversial part, because the deconceptualists believe that in this decade we just don't engage with the universities. We don't engage with the concepts. We just keep basically a silence. And the fear of the populism that we see everywhere is a reality that we have to cope with. You know, I was in Italy during the 4th election of Berlusconi, and every single liberal political person that I knew was repulsed by elections and parliamentary democracy. So, you know, we have a commitment when it goes in our favor, but we call it populism and Trumpism and so on when it goes against what we believe in. Now I'll say the second horrible thing. I don't mind Trump, and I'm not going to say Modi because Sujata will just, but if this is the way that the academic political network works, then you get what you put in. You know, this is what we've put into it, the very same concepts that produce these results. And if we want to continue to, see, I feel like we're 50 years from now, if social theory has changed, which I don't think it will, your children might ask you, you know, why were you doing sociology and spreading these kinds of concepts that were so useless? And what is our answer going to be? I was just doing my job. I tried to help. You know, something like this. So I think the approach the deconceptualists are taking is we're not going to participate at all. We're just going to experience and work with the rival sources of potential future concepts to organize political society. And while that's going to take a good deal of time, nothing bad is going to happen because nobody is manning the universities.
Okay. Yeah, last question. Don't you think that between recontextualization, reconceptualization, and deconceptualization, there is a sort of circularity, and we cannot actually put them on a linear path, like from decontextualization to reconceptualization and then to deconceptualization, because maybe to move forward we should be imagining it as a way to move from this circularity, which I see, because you start to reconceptualize after you have deconceptualized something else, to a sort of spiral to try and see if you can move forward instead of thinking it as, you know, as
yes.
the last step from.
Yeah, but you know that that a line segment of a spiral looks straight when you're close to it.
In 2 dimensions.
Yes, right? So that's, I don't think that's an issue. Mm-hmm. What happened from the 50s to 2017 looks like this if you dissect it, and then if you step back, I mean, you look at the Deobandi, you look at the movements in Islam in India around the early, during the national movement, and you had the very same argument playing out between what the nature of Islam in the modern state should be. So I think this has...
Don't you think they are immanent contemporaneous?
Yes, yes. But so is lived political life.
Okay.
So I don't think we're going to find something that from nowhere, right? The view from nowhere. We are going to just have to work with, as I think someone quoted Ulrich Beck, building the ship in open sea.